Well, again, everyone, I apologize for last week, but two of us would not have been here either, Al and Mac. And Mac was, yeah, how's your self-esteem now, Mac?
Well, it's still pretty good.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, that
At
that's a
this
great.
age, everybody's self-esteem should be pretty good.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah, at this stage, right? Well, I wanted to, just remind us where we've been. We finished up on chapter one, and the thing I like about this book, Fredrickson's text that we've been looking at, is that my suspicion is that she taught each of these chapters as a workshop or as a seminar at Boston University because they're very well researched and you know uh, and a little bit specialized too. There's a lot of specialized knowledge here that she's putting across. And so each of these chapters is, focused on a particular theme with respect to the development of Christianity in the first 5 centuries of the church, roughly from the time of Christ up to St. Augustine. Uh, and I wanted to remind you of a couple things. In the book, there are a series of maps that are really important to be aware of. I like maps, and when there are changes in regimes and changes in governments and emperors and things like the geography changes. And one thing that Fredrickson is trying to get across here is that geography and context, whether it's cultural or whether it's actually physical geography, has an effect on the way people understand the Christian tradition. And so knowing how those boundaries change over time is, kind of a nice thing to keep in mind. And it's I've never seen a book that so clearly lays out what the maps look like in each of the centuries. And so and at the beginning of every chapter, she also has a very helpful introduction. And I just want to remind you, where we've been by, reading this summary of what we talked about last time. And that is the idea of Israel. And the question she poses is, how did Jewish message of a Jewishly conceived end of time, a coming Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, all of these things that would have been reflective of who Jesus was, who the historical Jesus was, how did those things spill over to pagan auditors or pagan hearers? And how, after the apostolic generation, the first, after roughly the first, uh, up to about 70 of the Common Era, how, after that time, did this message shift, grow, and change into what eventually became Gentile Christianity? Over time, the Gentiles come to see themselves as, in many ways, the new Israel or the true Israel, drawing, reaching back into the Hebrew Bible and claiming that type of claiming that identity for themselves. And of course, we see this already with Paul planting the seeds, especially Romans. Um, and how did such a Jewish message finally transmute into anti-Jewish theology? While all of this was happening, as we've seen, there is a growing sense that Jews are outside the fold, and you know, Gentile Christianity draws from the Hebrew Bible what works well, but at the same time, they have a sense that Judaism is somehow lapsed, somehow illegitimate in the development. And then I did not include this, but I tried to put as much of the quote on one single page, but what she says in the last sentence is very important. To answer these questions, we first need to orient ourselves within two worlds, that of the Roman Mediterranean and that of the Jews who lived within it. And so remember how fluid some of those boundaries were from our last book on King Herod, right? Herod was at the same time a Jew and a Roman. And so there was that, that that fluidity that of boundaries. People move back and forth in these two worlds, some more so than others, right? If you were a Hellenized Jew, if you were one who spoke Greek in the Roman world at this time, your identity was probably going to be much more hybridized than that of the very conservative Jewish tradition that we knew was located in Jerusalem. And then finally, late Second Temple Judaism was the seedbed from which all later Christianity sprang. That was our focus in the first chapter in the idea of Israel. And I thought I'd just take this opportunity to see if there were any questions or thoughts about like that you'd like to, you know, maybe help summarize, because we're on to a new chapter now. Any thoughts?
Dan,
Yeah,
I think part of that is, the need, the felt need to put their own stamp of identity on what was to be Hellenized Christianity and differentiate it from, Judaism,
yeah,
so as to make it their own in terms of that that notion of, molecules of gas in a pressurized tank, marked, this is religious authority, is still trying to find itself, and differentiating it is probably as normal as one could expect.
yeah. And when trying to establish an identity, the easy way, the human way of doing things is by defining yourself over against whom you are not, right? But
Exactly.
what made this so it's the othering of the other. But what made this so interesting, and I think this is instructive for how people do this all the time, they will take from the other what is going to serve their sense of identity. So there is this love-hate relationship. There's much about Israel, much about the notion of Israel that the church wanted to adopt for itself in the first century, first and second, well, first 5 centuries, right? The idea of a spiritual Israel versus the physical Israel. And over time, the Jews become maligned as kind of it, and this will be important for when we get into the next chapter. They become maligned as the group that is focused on, this kind of concrete material world, the law and sacrifices, and focusing on things like circumcision as being important, whereas the church is going to see itself as, the more transcendent spiritual have a more transcendent spiritual identity. Well, guess what? There's some truth. There's some truth to the Jews being very concrete in this world, and but it gets maligned, right? The idea of a new Israel that is a spiritually transcendent type of Israel is a very Platonic notion. So um, you're beginning to see how the Greco-Roman philosophy of Plato, especially, fits into this sense of identity. So there's the Roman world influencing Jewish ideas, right? And what a mess. But in so doing, the differentiation between Christians and Jews is going to continue in a kind of intra-sectarian way. Now we're going to look at what it means to be truly Christian, and there are a variety of Christianities, and the process is going to continue, the othering, right? We are not you, and we are ourselves. You are muddled in your thinking, you outsiders, even though you call yourselves Christian, and we are orthodox in our thinking. So that's what our next chapter is going to be about. Let me get to our introductory chapter. Any more thoughts? Thank you, Denny. Oh, Lynn has joined us. Sorry, Lynn, didn't say hello to you. Well, this chapter is about as relevant, or at least the first section of this chapter is about as relevant to us today as anything could possibly be, right? And just this term, when Fredrickson was writing the book, the idea of diversity was seen as something to aspire to, or at least in the academy, right? Well, now diversity is seen as a problem. It's a word that's being taken out of many of our, if not all of our government documents. You've probably seen the list of words that the new administration has deemed uh, un-American, I guess is the right word. And DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, uh, you know, they're starting to become the othered words, right? The maligned words here. But this is, this issue of diversity is something that goes, it's a reflection of the one of the most basic philosophical questions. The most basic philosophical question, is why is there something instead of nothing? You know, then is this world real or is it an illusion? That's a question that the Buddhists tried to tackle. But then the other question is this world ultimately one and unified, or is it many? What is the connection between oneness and manyness? We perceive in the world, we intuitively perceive in the world a kind of order. We see this, in Paul's letter to the Romans. We see this in, the pagan religion itself is kind of an outgrowth of this perception of order in the world. And there must be one who orders that world, or there must be uh, gods who order that world. But at the same time, we recognize this vast diversity that's overwhelming in its infinitude, really, and the sense that it is uh, threatening in many ways. That it is something that we perceive as being ordered, but there's always this nagging sense behind us in the back of our mind that maybe there is no order to it at all. You know, maybe it's just matter in motion, as like Democritus tried to say. And this philosophical question has continued right up to the present. Think about, and I don't want to go off on too much of a rabbit hole here, but think about our current situation. Uh, for a while, this emphasis on diversity and on emphasizing the creativity that ensues when different perspectives and different viewpoints are considered, right? And many people want to celebrate that. Others say, no, that is a threat to unity, and we have a sense of how the world is unified, and you folks are asking questions that don't need to be asked. So now the pendulum is swinging in our current situation towards a more type of authoritarian type of government. Uh, this is a question that really is reflected in the conversation between Plato and Aristotle in the Greek world. Aristotle was Plato's student, and like any good student, uses Plato to think about a new paradigm. And so this is going to be the context into which we're going to talk about the development of orthodoxy in the first 5 centuries of the church. Uh, Orthodoxy, the name implies ortho, meaning straight, that there is a straight way of doing things, right? And anything outside of that doctrine, that doxy, is seen as a threat to unity. And we know this move towards orthodoxy started right from the very beginning. We see images of it in the Gospels themselves. So let me just read the epigraph, I guess. I think that's what they refer to this as, of this chapter. From the earliest sources, we have Paul's letter and the later Gospels, Remember, Paul's letters came before the Gospels. The message of salvation in Christ was clearly interpreted in a variety of ways. This very variety became a source of bitter internal arguments. Later, Gentile Christianities also produced many different interpretations of the Christian message. Its spokesman condemned diversity as deviance, as heresy. Heresy is bred in diversity, right? Once imperial politics, now here we go. Now here's where we start to add the sword to the mix, right? Once imperial politics with Constantine came into play, charges of heresy had serious social consequences. Heretics were considered a danger not only to the church, but also to the state. Wow, what a great summary of this idea in the first 5 centuries of the church. Any comments before I move on, um, or thoughts about this?
Has it changed that much for the Southern Baptist Convention?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a good the Southern Baptist Convention, if you want to look at a religious example of this, or any number of authoritarian regimes throughout the world, this idea that oneness is primary and manyness is secondary, that needs to be subordinate to oneness, right? Um, and the other option is that manyness is primary and oneness needs to be subordinate to manyness, right? And that even that thought is almost inconceivable to us because we've been so indoctrinated into a Platonic worldview that emphasizes that there is an absolute reality to which things must comply. Um, no, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed that much, but you can see how fundamentalism plays into this, right? We have the corner of the market on truth, and we are going to determine how that truth gets communicated. Any other thoughts or comments? I'm so tempted to go off on a political harangue here, but I am not going to do that. So this idea of diversity, as Fredrickson points out, is present from the very beginning of the church. Uh, it, Even in the Gospels, we see, in the Gospel of Matthew, that by 85 of the Common Era, there were already people who were claiming Jesus as Messiah, but not in the same way as others, specifically the Matthean community. So we see that verse in gospel that's in the Gospel of Matthew that says, there are some who say, Lord, Lord, who are really not truly my disciples. Um, I'm on page 20 or 31 right now. Um, Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, warns Matthew's Jesus, will enter the kingdom of heaven. He continues, on that day, the day of judgment, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name? Do not many deeds of power in your name? Not good enough, says Fredrickson. Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you evildoers. And that's in Matthew 7, early on in Matthew's gospel. So we don't want to think about that as something that Jesus actually said. We don't know for sure, but we do know that Matthew wrote it, and he wrote it to a community. And we have to ask that historical critical question, because that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that is a text that is completely unique to Matthew. I may be wrong about that, but that might be the so-called M material. But the question we need to ask is, what was going on in 85 of the Common Era in this Jewish Christian community to whom Matthew was writing that required Jesus, these words, to be either remembered or to be placed in the mouth of Jesus? And Fredrickson says it was very clear, even by this time, there were people who were claiming to have the corner on the market on explaining who Jesus was. we go back even further and we see that Paul is also doing this, right? We know that Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and in his writings, especially to the Corinthians, the letter to the Corinthians, there are people coming to Corinth and preaching a slightly different message than what Paul had in mind. But we really see it in the letter to the Galatians. In fact, it's pretty clear that the reason Paul is writing to the Galatians is because there have been interlopers from outside coming into the church, and I should be more specific. They are what Paul refers to as Judaizers, right? Claiming that no, 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 if you're going to follow Jesus, you must be a Jew. You must be a Jew first, and then you can be part of the new Israel, the new kingdom that Jesus comes to proclaim. And Paul is adamant. I mean, he jumps right into it. Unlike the letter to the Philippians, where he writes, "Oh, I just remember you so also fondly. Everything is great here. You folks really supported me." No, he just jumps right into Galatians. All right, let's, this is Daddy coming home, right? Wait till Papa gets home, saying what I'm hearing from you folks in Galatia really concerns me because there are outsiders who are starting to upset the order, the ordo of the church, um, and leave it to Paul to write a pretty fiery letter about that. So, but I mean, these are examples even from the first half of the first century, or the first quarter, the 3/4 of the first century, that there are conflicts going on, as we might expect from if you've ever been to any kind of a committee meeting. There's always somebody who thinks they're reading the Constitution the way it should be read. Um, any thoughts about that? Also recognize that that Paul, in writing to the Galatians, really sets up that dichotomy that's later going to be used by the church to accuse Jews of being people of the flesh, right? Paul, in making his argument, says, if you are a member of Christ, it is a spiritual conversion that takes place. It is not a physical requirement. You do not need to become, circumcised, because we are working on a different plane. So, in other words, bypassing any kind of physical requirement, any kind of law that requires someone to be circumcised. And then, uh, setting up a new understanding of what it means to be part of the body of Christ. Um, and Fredrickson points out, I'll just say this very, very briefly, but if we look at some of the Dead Sea Scrolls material from the Second Temple, it's really clear that there's all kinds of intersectarian fighting that's going on among Jews. And we know this when we read the Herod book. So the whole idea is that, diversity implies some sort of error. And this is where now I cannot remember the name, the article that was sent. And there are a couple David Brooks articles that have been written very recently. And for the life of me, Sharon, you mentioned one of these. Can you remind me what the article was? I had it in my head last week, but I don't have it in my head this week.
I was scrambling to look it up, Dan, because I saw the date on there. So I thought there are a number of them, as Danny knows too, that I've been looking at lately.
Right, right.
Um, I
but-
wasn't quite sure, but I'm going to look it up. Maybe I'll have it in a minute here.
Yeah, gosh, I'm starting to be a little concerned about what seems to be the diminishing capacity of my my brain to remember things. But
Well,
if you
that makes two of us at
yeah,
least.
well, perhaps all of us, um, but if you've been reading David Brooks lately, he's been discussing, this very issue of the one and the many as well, Um, But this idea of heresy really is a seed that gets planted in the first century, and it's really the source of what we later come to know as the apostolic succession. The way that you know that your uh, gospel is the true gospel is, does it come from one of the apostles themselves? Is there a direct line from Jesus' apostles, of course, including Paul in that as well? This is, by the way, I mean, this is why Paul had to push this idea of him being an apostle, right? Because even in, 50 of the Common Era, there were these distinctions being made. Oh, we knew Jesus and that guy didn't. And Paul had to make his case in his very Hellenistic way that he was an apostle of Christ. So, trying to legitimize himself. Eventually, we're going to see that those who are outside the fold, those who do not fall in line of the apostolic succession, um, will be deemed in a very general way Gnostic. And this is kind of a catch-all phrase for a number of heresies. And Fredrickson makes this clear later on in the chapter, a number of heresies, but there are a variety of so-called Gnostic heresies that the church wanted to fight against at that time. So, I just included this papyrus. By the way, this Galatians text, the introduction to Galatians that I was alluding to, is one of the oldest texts, that we have on papyrus, dating from around 200 of the Common Era. We can't find a hard copy of anything that goes, and this is just a fragment of the text, right? In fact, I think it's Galatians, and then there's the end of another text, maybe probably Second Corinthians, if it follows the order. But anyway, I mean, this is how the texts were sent around the Roman Empire at the time, carried on the Roman way and from church to church. But when it comes to hard evidence, we have about 200 years of silence when it comes to these texts. So a lot, as we can see, happens in those 200 years. Other comments or questions? Well, Fredrickson makes the very good point that when you're trying to find the true Christianity, we have to acknowledge that the Christianity that even starts to develop in the second generation of followers of Christ already has to change the narrative, right? Because of something that Jesus said. And she wants to point out the so-called fallacy of the unbroken tradition. Apostolic succession goes all the way back through Peter to Jesus. Well, those apostles had to even change the tradition early on because Jesus said, hey, look, get ready. The kingdom is coming. I will return. Paul firmly believed this, so much so that, one of the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, marriage, Paul was saying, I don't think you should get married because Jesus is coming back. Why split your time between a wife or a husband and preaching the gospel? Well, Jesus didn't return. And so people had to find a way to, revise their apocalypticism. What does it mean for the kingdom of God, to be present? What was Jesus talking about his return? And many people say, well, I think what he originally was saying was that he would be resurrected, and then we didn't quite know that, or we didn't quite understand. And we see that in the Gospel of John, this hermeneutic of remembering, that after the resurrection, they look back on the things that Jesus said, and we get it now, right? But what is clear is that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who was wrong, right? And the church has to deal with that. So they create their own orthodoxy around what to believe. And today, one of the ways we deal with this, even in the 21st century, is that the kingdom of God is here by the presence of the Holy Spirit, but also near, that Christ will eventually return. I don't personally, I probably shouldn't mention this, but I don't personally hold to the near idea. I believe that the return of Christ happens in the Holy Spirit, that the church is is the presence of Christ. And if the church is doing its job as it should be, it's questionable if that's the case, but we don't need for Jesus to return. So that, by the way, is unorthodox. Speaking of heresy, just so you know, you've got an unorthodox book group leader. But here's where Fredrickson is going to bring in this socioeconomic and educational divide that begins happening around the turn of the 1st to the 2nd century. This idea of a unified trans-local church. In other words, every church around the Mediterranean has to be unified in some way, right? This is why we have, by the middle of the 2nd century, people saying we all need to be reading the same gospels. All of this is, she says, a function of rhetoric. This is a rhetorical necessity. Let me read what I'm referring to here. I'm on now page 34. A unified translocal church, in short, was a notion created not by social reality, but by the demands of rhetoric. Rhetoric, trying to make an argument and uphold your points. My side, since true, is uniform. Yours, which is false, must therefore be pluriform. And by the 4th century, this idea of translocal uniformity was also demanded, if never achieved, by imperial politics. This is when the law of the gospel, when the uniformity of the gospel message becomes the uniformity of the state, the imperial uniformity, which was so important, which sought to support a unified empire. So uniformity, 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 so important. And we have a difficult time really getting back to the people who were being condemned for heresy, because all we have are the writings of the church fathers, and who were rhetoricians, who were educated in the art of rhetoric. And one of the things you do in rhetoric, we see this in in legal debates all the time, or any kind of debate. You set up a straw man. You oversimplify the position of your opponent to the point of making it your opponent's perspective seem like an absurdity. Oversimplifying and accusing in half-truths and things along those lines. Something that our media does quite well on both sides of the spectrum, I should say. But that's all a matter of rhetoric. But when you do that, that leaves us with absolutely no knowledge of what maybe some legitimate points on the side of some of the heretical authors, people like Valentinus and others, were saying. All we have are the straw men that the early church fathers set up. And so we have to extrapolate, we have to reverse engineer from some of these commentaries, Tertullian, for example, on what the real problem was of people from outside the fold. So when we read about heresies, we really have to take their ideas with a grain of salt, because what we're reading are the opinions of the people who prevailed, history being written by the side of the victors, right? From the perspective of the victors. We don't have any access to those illiterate groups sometimes, let alone those who were literate. It's another point that uh, that Fredrickson wants to make, is that some of the people you were opposing weren't even literate. They weren't writing things, right? And so we have no idea what the diversity looked like in its complexity in the early centuries of the church. I wanted to introduce you, if you don't know this, this is another painting, or it's a fresco really, that's in the Vatican, referred to as the School of Athens, and it has a lot of the Roman and Greek philosophers represented, but the center of the school in Athens features Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And you notice that Plato is pointing up, right? And Aristotle is pointing down. And this is these are the two approaches to understanding the world, right? And in it's certainly the first 5 centuries of the church, and all the way up to about 1000 of the Common Era, Plato is going to be the one who prevails. When through the Crusades, the Catholic Church, encounters Muslims, they also encounter translations of Aristotle that are, I wouldn't say completely contrary to Plato, but employ a different method for arriving at truth. Plato, we might say, is a deductive reasoner. You start with a definition of things, and everything, falls from that. Whereas Aristotle, who's we could say is more the founder of the scientific method, starts with an inductive, start to draw conclusions about your observations of various things in the world and unify it in reaching a point of what you perceive to be a truth that you can defend, a defendable truth, deductive versus inductive. The early part of the church, however, the early centuries of the church relied heavily on Plato, and that creates the foundation for the type of uniformity that we're talking about here. And if you don't remember Plato, and I'm sorry if I offend you by giving you a quick rundown, but Plato assumed that there was this transcendental world, which was the realm of ideas or the realm of forms. He refers to them roughly in the same way, not roughly, in exactly the same way. And that world of forms is absolute and does not change. It's a conceptualized world. It's not heaven or anything like that. But the classic example is, you're in a room that has 4 or 5 different types of chairs, right? One chair is red and has 3 legs, and the other chair is, blue and has 6 legs, and whatever. But somehow that these things all are chairs. Because why? Because they all participate in some imperfect way in the realm of ideas. Somewhere in the realm of ideas, there is the perfect idea of a chair, and that idea does not change, right? So if you're going to know knowledge, if you're going to have any knowledge at all, and this is where Aristotle differed from Plato, the last thing in the world you want to do is to pander in this world of constant change, right? I can go outside and I can recognize a tree, and I can say, well, there's a tree. I'm going to study trees today. And you go back a couple of weeks later, it's not the same tree. As the leaves are out now, and maybe a storm has has changed it. This world is constantly changing. How can you arrive at any type of absolute truth based upon observations of this changing dynamic world, right? So Plato helps to answer that question. If you really want to study trees, you study the idea of trees. You don't study trees themselves because they are always going to lead you down into the path of plurality. Think of the infinite number of trees out there. How can you know anything about truth? Observing the infinite variety of our world. And so Plato, the student of Socrates, really comes to be foundational for the Greco-Roman world, establishing the idea that in this world of change, there is a realm of order that can be achieved through the study of philosophy, through using one's reason. And you can communicate by that using rhetoric, of course, but the first thing you do is must reason about the world. You must use your noggin, right? What is going to influence Christianity most? Now, I can't say that because there's a lot about Plato that's going to be. By the way, and I've said this before, I think in this setting, Plato really sets up a political philosophy that becomes foundational for a type of authoritarianism where the philosophers are kings. The philosophers are the ones who run the world and have insight into truth, and everybody else basically steps to based upon what the philosophers have to say. So, but the one place where Plato is going to influence Christianity that is of interest to us, at least at this point, at this juncture, is in the idea of creation. How was the world created? But before I get into that, I want to stop and see, because I've been talking about 15 minutes straight. If you've been wanting to jump in, please let me know. Any questions or comments?
Dan?
Yeah.
Oh, well, somebody has to ask this about the cave and the shadows.
Yeah. Great. Another example of what you're talking about, right? The cave analogy. Plato tries to explain what stupid. Basically, this is played out in the Republic as well. But this world, said Plato, is like a bunch of people living in caves, and they're watching shadows that are created on the wall by firelight, and they say to themselves, "Wow, this is truth to us, right?" And it's all really a fantasy until somebody breaks away from the cave, ascends, and comes into the world of light, and thus the world of ideas, right? And then goes back into the cave and tries to tell people that these images on the wall are they're chimerical, I think is the word, chimeras, chimerae, whatever. They're fantasies. They have no reflection reality whatsoever. The real light doesn't come from the fire here. It comes from outside the cave and a world beyond the cave. And I've seen it. But to try to explain that to people is very difficult because they want to stay locked in their own illusion. And so the philosophers are the ones who have ascended to this new understanding of the world. Is that your understanding too, Will? Is that how you remember it?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, good job. Thank
Yeah.
you. I just wanted you to review it and see what connection it had here.
Well, it has a great connection because all of the heretics, the people who are going to be deemed heretics, are going to be seen. Well, ironically, they're going to be referred to as Gnostics, the people who emphasize the knowledge of God, but they're going to be seen as the poor little, stiffs down in the cave who have no real insight into the world, whereas the Orthodox have seen the sun S-U-N as well as the S-O-N, and have established orthodoxy based upon absolute truths, right? So very relevant. Any other comments? Do you all know? I have a hard time remembering, but I think you all know Plato a little bit, and I don't want to belabor the point too much. But the cave analogy and everything, and if this doesn't match up with your memory, please let me know, because sometimes you can teach something so often that you start to believe your own thinking about it instead of what's that. Denny's laughing because he knows exactly what I'm talking about, you know. But Plato wrote a book called the Timaeus, and this is the book about cosmogony. How was the world created? Uh, and in the Timaeus, remember, this world was never this world of physis, or nature, of matter, has always been. It was always constantly in flux, and it is co-eternal with a the world of ideas, right? With the one. So you have the one who is the conceptual uniformity of all things. Then you have down below, I guess, if you want to think of it in terms of spatial categories, you have the many, chaos. Well, this world was then, we don't know where this person comes from, but a demiurge. This is a god who is somehow created in order to go about the task of creation. And Plato says that this demiurge begins to fashion the world of chaos into the world that we now know. Well, how does he do that? Well, he's got the blueprint right up above, right? He's got the world of ideas up above. So you got this demiurge, working in between. You've got chaos down below, and matter, as we want to call it, physis, where we get our word physical from. And the demiurge is taking the matter and creating trees and creating the entire world itself. And this world is a reflection, an imperfect reflection of that world of ideas. So you have a good example, even in the world we're talking about, of the one and the many. The one, the world of ideas, and then the many being this very chaotic and ever-changing world of matter. This comes to influence reflections on God, right? And reflections on Jesus. Because you can't help but say, okay, if this is the predominant idea of how the world was created, how does Jesus fit into this? And how does the Greek, or how does the Hebrew God of the Bible fit into this? And there were some people who were saying, well, Jesus is someone who came from the world of ideas. He had a perfect understanding of the world of ideas. And he came like Will, I'm so grateful for the cave illusion that you're mentioning. Like one coming from outside in the world of sunshine, he came into the cave to reveal that the God of the Hebrew Bible isn't the real God. The God of the Hebrew Bible is the demiurge, right? And it's a mistake to worship that demiurge, that creator who is not the highest God. But that's what the Jews have been doing all along. And for some people, that makes a lot of sense, right? It makes a lot of sense. But then again, you have this question about the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created through the Logos. Well, was Jesus somehow associated with Jesus now? Was he the demiurge in some way? So you see how ideas about Christianity are developing in conversation with ideas that cannot even be found in the Bible. by the way, eventually what's going to happen here is that councils will establish the doctrinal idea of God creating out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, that God is not dependent on creation. God was not required to create. There was no force involved with this. God did not need to create. God was absolute. But there was no co-eternal matter. This is what eventual Christian doctrine will say. Because if something is co-eternal with God, that makes it a God, right? Because gods by definition are eternal. So God created out of nothing. And this has served, interestingly, to support people who have a difficult time with the resurrection, right? Well, what about those people who died 500 years ago? And the question is answered by saying, well, God created the world out of nothing, and God could very easily create human bodies in which souls are encapsulated, create those out of nothing. So don't worry about, a resurrection of your actual body. It will be a spiritual body that is created for you. And so, one thing just leads to another, and we have all kinds of questions. By the end of the first century, questions like these, because of the influx, because of the introduction of Greek philosophical ideas, and especially ideas about the world of the forms being absolute and unchanging, and the world below as being somehow imperfect and changing always, and therefore not be able to be trusted. These are going to have ramifications for the way that Orthodox Christianity develops. And we don't have time, and this is really probably more of a sideline, but let me just say, this, I should probably warn you, was one of my areas of specialty when I was in graduate school. It's called the Platonic mystical tradition. And so it's always fun for me to get back and kind of review this. But eventually there's going to be another type of Platonism that develops that is going to influence the church even more. Plato lived in the 4th century BCE, but he had followers, afterwards who continued to, develop his thought, especially along the lines of the Timaeus and cosmogony, the creation of the world. So by the time we get to the 3rd century, there is a philosopher by the name of Plotinus who comes up with something called Neoplatonism, or a new type of Platonism, that is going to influence an understanding of theology that will have ramifications all the way up to the very present. I thought I would have time to go off onto a little sidetrack there, but it probably won't be worth our while, because Fredrickson really doesn't develop this, or at least she hasn't yet that I have seen. But if you ever want to know about Neoplatonism, it is the foundation of Jewish mysticism that we read about in the Kabbalah, a document that was probably written around the 10th century, I believe, but probably has predecessors going back to this time period, as well as Christian mysticism. Neoplatonism influences Christian mysticism, men like Meister Eckhart and women like Hildegard of Bingen and others. So we really didn't get very far into, we got about 5 pages into our chapter. But when we return, Fredrickson's going to talk about a number of so-called heretics, right? Valentinus, Marcion, and hopefully the development of her. Justin Martyr actually is going to be not a heretic, but he's going to be one of the Orthodox. But hopefully you will see how this Platonic philosophy is used against heretics, but it's also used to develop Christian theology. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the dilemmas of diversity, and my goodness, we're still dealing with that problem today. So who wants the last word? Any questions or comments? Well, if not, you will do well to read the entire second chapter. I will do my best to to stay on track. There's so much here that I just want to go off on tangents with. So, but thank you, Will. By the way, the cave analogy is really important here as well. And that was one of Lovekin's favorite. I rarely had a conversation with David Lovekin where he didn't bring up the cave analogy. You know, David uh, was very enamored of it. So, okay, I'm going to stop our share, and I'll see you all sometime soon next week.